Or you can just hit the button. Yes. Very good. Thank you. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to our monthly Drupal for Gov webinar series. We host these, or we should say, we try to host these every month on the third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We got a little out of sync after the shutdown, but we are on a roll and are in the process of scheduling out the rest of 2019. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. Just a quick note about who Drupal for Gov is. Drupal for Gov is a nonprofit organization that is committed to providing resources to government employees, or what we call government adjacent, right? Those that support government, whether it's city and local, state, federal, and even international. So this webinar series grew out of a BOF that was held at several different DrupalCons, where there were government staff who said, look, we don't live in DC, we don't work in DC, and so while Drupal for Gov puts on events in the DC area, it would be nice if there were other options for those of us not local. So that's where the webinar series came from. And so we would appreciate any ideas that you might have for future topics, things you'd like to hear, or topics that you have heard presented elsewhere, and we will try to get those scheduled. So one of the big things that Drupal for Gov does, not just these webinars, most of you may have heard of us from Drupal GovCon. It's an annual event that we hold in the summer at the NIH facility in Bethesda, Maryland. We also participate in providing a Gov Summit at DrupalCon. We held those, we've been holding those for about 4 years now. We do those on one of the summit days at DrupalCon. We participate in Drupal's global training days as much as we're able to, and then of course this webinar series. And I'll point out that next month's webinar has been scheduled. It's called Optimizing and Reducing Web Development Timelines Through Component Reuse. So it's a great talk on web components and why you should know what they are and why you might want to use them. And it's a good segue into the next event that we host, which is going to be Drupal GovCon, which is going to be held this summer, July 24th through the 26th. It's a good segue because the gentleman who is delivering that webinar is then also offering full-day training on the Tuesday prior to our event. So the 3 dates for the conference itself are July 24th through 26th, but we'll have a significant amount of training being held the day prior, that Tuesday. So if you are not already registered for Drupal GovCon, I encourage you to do so. It's completely free. It's a 3-day event, including training and lunch and coffee. So go ahead and register today to make sure that you grab your ticket. We do usually sell out, and so it's a great event. We get a lot of great feedback and hope to see you there. But if you're interested in in web components, try to catch the webinar series in June and then consider registering for the training when those signups become available. So I will put some of those links into the chat here after turning it over to Mike. The one last thing I want to mention about Drupal GovCon is that we do offer travel scholarships for those not in the local area, but the deadline for those scholarships submissions is next Friday. So if you get to the Drupal GovCon website, under the community tab, you'll see scholarships. If travel costs are what are preventing you from coming to the event, then please consider applying for a travel scholarship, and we'll see if we can't offset some of those costs. So now I'd like to kind of turn this over to Mike. I'll let Mike introduce himself and tell a little bit more about him, but Mike is a good friend and colleague and one of our biggest supporters and volunteers with Drupal for Gov and Drupal GovCon specifically. So I'm excited to hear his talk, and Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jess. I appreciate that. And hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about configuration workflow in Drupal 8. Just to introduce myself, I'm Mike Madison. I am a manager and architect on the professional services team at Acquia. I'm one of the organizers for Drupal GovCon, as Jess just mentioned, and I'm also one of the maintainers of Acquia's build and launch tools. Previously, I actually worked at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which was is a Department of Energy lab, and I headed up the Drupal team there, which is how I came to be involved with the Drupal for Gov group. And GovCon has been an important part of my Drupal calendar every year. So I would just echo Jess's urging, if you're in the DC area and if you can get up to Bethesda, it is well worth your time to join for a couple of days. So today we're going to be really focused on Drupal 8 configuration. We're going to get into some different approaches for managing configuration. We're going to talk about configuration workflow, and hopefully have some time at the end for Q&A. If you have some questions while we're going through today, feel free to throw those in chat. I have it open on a different screen, and I will try to answer your questions as we go. I gave a talk very similar to this one at Drupal GovCon last year, and I do just want to repeat an updated disclaimer. What I'm recommending today is what I'm recommending today. If you see me talk about configuration next year, or if you're, moving towards Drupal 8, but it's in the future, 6 months out, 8 months out, I would definitely advise that you just kind of check the status of the community temperature on what I'm talking about today. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but the talk I gave last summer at GovCon is different than this one because things have changed since then. So just pay attention. And that is actually my first takeaway for today. Config is not a set it and forget it sort of thing with Drupal 8. You do need to stay sort of in the loop of what's going on in the community, and you do need to make sure that not only the configuration on a given site, but also your approach to using configuration if you're building and managing multiple sites over time, it will likely change. Some quick things I just want to define and separate quickly before we jump in today as well. You will hear me talk about config or configuration. And those are actual Drupal things, right? The configuration is something that exists either in your file system or in Drupal. We'll talk about that more. Your configuration management strategy is one of several different approaches that you might take to manage the config. We'll talk about that as well. And then there's a configuration workflow, which is a really critical part of your development or DevOps process that will implement your configuration management strategy to actually manage your config. So you will likely see all of these words throughout my presentation. You'll hear me say them at different times. I always like to just level set on how I'm using things before we get going. If you look at D.O, this is how the Drupal community defines configuration. And while this is, an accurate definition, I think it is a little misleading. Just because there is such a severe overlap between what is config and what is content. So a couple of quick examples. If you wanted to add a menu to your site, the physical act of adding the menu creates a config object in Drupal for that menu. Main menu, for example, is a config object. However, as soon as you go and add a home link into your main menu, that home link itself is content. The content cannot exist without the config, but they are fundamentally different in the way Drupal treats them. Similarly, talking about the user entity, if you were to create a role, that is config. If you were to define a permission, that actually is probably custom code, but when you associate the permission to a role, that is config. But then when you actually take a physical user and assign a role to a user, that is content that is stored on the user itself. So, the definition that Drupal provides is, again, it is strictly speaking accurate, but it is a very blurry line until you get a good feel for what is actually there. Making it slightly more confusing, there are two different types of config that Drupal 8 deals with. There's entity config. So this is any configuration related to the definition of a content type, the fields going into that content type, all of your display modes for the form, literally anything that you do as a site builder to go through and build out taxonomy, content, views, all of that stuff falls under entity config. And as a general rule, entity config is pretty complex. We'll look at some examples of entity config in a little bit. And it's some pretty funky YAML. There's a lot of stuff that goes in there. There's a lot of cross dependencies, and it's not the sort of thing that you want to mess about with. Then there's simple config. Simple config is stuff that Drupal uses to just store values, basically. It's a lot of key value pairs. So the site name, what theme is active, cache settings, what is the minimum cache age for your site? Are you aggregating JavaScript? Can users register for the site, etc.? And even though fundamentally we're talking about the same types of things at a very, very, very high level anyway, the differences in these two configs are again, pretty obvious, and we'll look at those here in a little bit. Perhaps the most complicated thing about the configuration management system in D8 is that it lives in two places. So in a given Drupal site that you can log into or go visit right now, all of the configuration lives in a configuration table in the database. We call that active config. However, if your project is architected the way I will be recommending you do so in this presentation, you will also have YAML files living in your file system, in your Git repository, wherever, that are part of your site, that theoretically should match line for line what is in active config. The confusing thing is that if you make a change to the YAML file, if you deploy an update, if you put out a new version of your code, changing those YAML files has zero impact on what's in the database. You actually have to do some sort of synchronization between the two. Likewise, changing what's in the database has no impact in what's in your YAML files. So obviously this is a problem. This is one of the definitive Drupal 8 challenges that every project has to overcome. How do you execute a proper development workflow? How do you preserve changes after updates? And how do you make sure you're not going to break your site in the process? And thankfully, this is something that's been solved, right? Because most people use configuration in the same general way, right? Drupal uses it for everything. Every form, every checkbox, everything in the Drupal admin UI has some sort of configuration behind it. Literally everything. You can use configuration to access the current state of something. So, if you're writing custom PHP, you can actually use the Drupal container to go into the config and say, what is my Google Analytics API key that's stored in this place? Can users register for this site, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anything that's in config, you can access through an entity or a config query and basically get access to it. Defining stuff. So, if you need to write a custom form, if you need a custom permission, anything like that, config will be used along with PHP to typically store the values from that custom code that you're writing. And then also config's used to actually support a proper development workflow, right? In some world, somewhere, if you really wanted to, yeah, you could totally log into your production website and do all your site building in prod and just do it live. That's not a good idea. So, in a proper development workflow, you want to be creating new things, deleting old things, updating existing things with version control, with automated testing, using continuous integration to push these things out into your higher environments, right? I mean, this is standard development stuff. And using a proper configuration workflow as part of your development process is absolutely something you can do with Drupal 8. So let's talk through an example of what this development workflow might look like. So let's pretend for a moment that I'm a developer on this project. And in this case, I have been assigned a ticket that is to add a blog into a site that does not currently have one. So locally, I'm going to do a clean install of Drupal. I'm going to do all the necessary site building to create that blog, right? I'm going to go into structure, content types. I'm going to add my blog. I'm going to create and assign fields. I'm going to configure my form and node display. I'm going to go ahead and add a blog view. Might even add some roles and permissions to those roles for blog creators and blog publishers. And then I'm done, right? At the end of that, I've basically met all of my acceptance criteria. Hopefully, I've done everything that my ticket told me to do, and I'm ready for somebody to review it. But as a developer, hopefully, I'm working locally. I'm working in some sort of local development. This is where the configuration workflow starts to kick in. Now I can export the configuration out of my local database, and I can commit those YAML files into a Git repository. Hopefully you're doing some automated testing, right? So I can write some BHAT tests that will actually go through and test to make sure that, hey, my blog is there. My content author or my blog author can actually create a blog article. My publisher can actually publish it. An anonymous user can come in and see published articles on my blog view. And then I'll do a pull request that sort of bundles up all of that site building in the form of YAML and all of my automated tests in BHAT into a single pull request. Ideally, there's some continuous integration that happens that will test all of these things. Maybe a lead dev or an architect or QA dev comes in and wants to manually test and review what was done. So as an architect, I could pull down my developer's code. I could also do a clean install of Drupal. I could import the configuration that he or she created. And that importing of configuration is then going to create the blog content type, pull in all the necessary fields, the displays, the views, the permissions, the roles, all of the things that that developer just did into my local now that I'm the architect. I can then do all of the review that I want to actually see that development, and then I can merge the pull request. And then finally, when the end of the sprint or the end of the release, whatever happens, but we actually want to deploy this new blog out into our upper environments, now I can deploy files, I can do a database update, I can import configuration and flush the caches, and just like magic, we now have a blog and all of the associated features for that blog out on production or whatever environment that you want it to have. So my second takeaway today is that config is hard. It is going to bite you sooner or later, even if it's just a really messy git merge. Like, something's going to happen with config. And if you follow a proper development workflow, if you're doing testing, if you're using Git for your version history, if you're doing all of the stuff that I just sort of prescribed, you're going to severely limit the chances of config really hurting you in the process, right? Because if the developer makes a mistake all the way back at the beginning of this process, if there's automated tests, if you've got a code review process, if you've got a QA process, theoretically, anything that that developer screws up should be found and then fixed prior to any sort of deployment going out into the cloud. On the other hand, if you're not managing config, if you're just like literally going in and doing site building or manually importing stuff without really testing it and working through like you would custom PHP or custom JavaScript, you're going to do something sooner or later that's going to break your site. Best case scenario, it's a little oopsie, and you can undo a checkbox or you can put it back or whatever, and it's not a big deal. Worst case scenario, if you badly format some YAML, if you're trying to do things sort of without testing, I mean, you can literally bring down an entire Drupal site. If your YAML's broken and the config import fails. So definitely work hard to limit where it can bite you and make sure that you're following a thorough process for testing. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different flavors of configuration management. We're going to go through each of these. I did include features, and we'll talk about having no strategy at all, using what Drupal core gives you, and then some of the different contrib-based solutions like config split and config ignore that you can use. So the main reason I put features in here is because it's still something I hear people talking about. I was in a meeting recently and I heard somebody talking about reverting your features. So features is definitely something that you should leave in the past. Features is a great necessity for Drupal 7. It is not something you should try to do at all in Drupal 8. Even Mike Potter from Phase 2, who is the maintainer of features, wrote a really nice blog post about a year and a half ago now saying don't use features. The reason for that is that features is a partial config workflow. And what I mean by that is the way features works is it essentially passes the partial -- partial flag into drush config import. And what that does is it only changes some of your config. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Mike, you just said config can bite me. Isn't it safer to only change some of the config? It is until it isn't. And what I mean by that is, a big part of doing mirroring between your environments, local, dev, stage, prod, is that you should know 100% that what you're doing locally is exactly what's happening in continuous integration. What's happening in CI should be exactly the same as what's happening in dev stage and prod. And when you're doing a partial config import, the partial import is not going to basically resync all of your config to match what's in your file system. It's only going to update some of it. So if you happen to have something in your production site that's different than what's in your development site, for example, you could do a deployment into dev and it would work fine. And then you could do a deployment into prod and it would break. So there is actually some serious repercussions for using a features-based workflow if you're not really strict and stringent on how you manage and maintain that workflow. So my advice is, don't use features. Let's move on and talk about some of the other options. This is one I've seen actually a couple times recently. And hopefully you can tell how I feel about it. And this is having no strategy at all. The biggest problem here is not that you're not managing configuration, because as I said earlier, Drupal uses config for everything. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you're using Drupal 8 and you're not using config, you're crazy. Like, you have to use config. If you have any content types on your website whatsoever, you're using configuration. If you have users, you have configuration, right? I mean, obviously, if you're using Drupal, you're using configuration. And sooner or later, when you update Drupal versions, when you write a new module, when you do something, you're going to have to change that configuration. So not having a strategy for managing your configuration basically means that anytime you need to update config, you're doing it a different way. Maybe you have a couple different developers doing it in code. Maybe you have somebody just logging in and doing it by hand. Maybe you're doing it, who knows how you're doing it. But not having a strategy is going to cause major problems at some point in the future. And it is really, truly impossible to have a consistent strategy for testing and managing your development. So again, make sure you have some strategy. Honestly, features is a better strategy than no strategy, but definitely make sure you have a strategy for managing config. Next one is core only. The methods that Drupal core gives you for managing config are actually nicely bundled in a little briefcase that you can just grab, and it's everything you need. I would not say that it is terribly robust. It does not support a lot of edge cases or even useful cases, but it is better than nothing, and it does work great. Literally, you do a drush config export, drush CEX. You can also log into the UI and export the config as a tar directly out of the UI, use drush, but you can do it through the UI. And then you can do a drush config import, drush CIM, or again, use the UI, and it's very straightforward. It just works. The big con of doing the core only method is that it doesn't allow for any logical variation. So as an example, let's say that locally, I want to use some tools for development. Frequent examples of that would be the devel module, dblog module, views UI module, field UI module, etc. Things that make it pretty freaking hard to develop Drupal sites without. On the other hand, best practices say you should not have devel turned on in production. You should not have views UI turned on in production, etc., etc. Well, a big part of what configuration manages is what modules are turned on. What configuration is going to get imported between those different environments depends on the modules that are turned on. So if you're using the core only configuration approach, you can't have devel turned on in your config locally and turned off in your config for production, because you're using the same exact config in both places. So that's a bit of a gap. Another big one's API keys. I did some work for the MTA a couple years ago in New York, and they have different systems that they communicate with for their signage system in development versus in production, which, if you think about it, makes sense. You don't want to accidentally send test and dev data out into your production signs. That's bad. So again, having different API keys or different services that you're using for development and testing purposes versus production, again, core only config doesn't actually support that use case very easily. Another big one is that core only config absolutely is not designed for multi-site, which makes no sense to me because multi-site's a pretty big feature of Drupal, but I don't make the rules, I just tell you about them. A great example here is site name. Site name is stored in the system.site config. So if you want to have 50 different websites on a multi-site platform, all running the exact same config, exact same Drupal code, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that's how multi-site works. You can only have one site name because system.site is going to be stored and shared across all of your sites. So again, core only is better than nothing. It works okay. But what you really want to look at is a config split based workflow. Config split does support variation between sites. So you could actually have a couple of different or 50 different or however many different sets of configuration. It supports sort of a default configuration model, and I'll illustrate this here in a little bit, where you have most of your config defined for most of your sites or across the platform, and then you can override only certain things, which is great. It is awesome for both single and multi-site, and it is the best choice for projects, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that here real quick. So when you're doing Drupal development, there's a couple of different types of development that you might be doing. If you're contributing to Drupal core, if you're maintaining a module, if you're maintaining an install profile, you're still going to have to deal with configuration because, again, Drupal uses config for everything. But at that point, you're kind of in your own little microcosm, right? You're dealing with the config that you care about for just that module or just your install profile. On the other hand, when you're talking about dealing with a project, like Drupal GovCon, for example, is a project, you need a much broader swath of configuration management for a project than you do for an individual module. And config split definitely fits the bill for project-based management. We'll talk about other options here in a moment. Cons of config split, it is significantly more challenging to manage a config split workflow than a core-based workflow. And hopefully you see why based on some of the examples I've been giving you back and forth. But the config split based workflow does require you to keep track of what goes where, why is it here, why is it not there, should everything get this or only a couple things get this. So, be aware it does add complexity despite being my recommended solution. And I'm just going to call it out. This is an entirely contributed solution. This is not something that is core maintained. We've already seen a change happen in the last year or so that bites config split. Drupal core changed the way it stores install profile values. And we've had major problems recently with people trying to do install profiles and use config split because of that change. So this is a big part of the reason at the beginning of the talk I said, you kind of have to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on with Drupal config. Because the tools you need aren't in core, and the contrib tools that you want are not in core. So we'll just leave it at that. This doesn't mean don't do it. It just means, again, don't set it, don't forget it, and walk away. Keep an eye on what's going on. Back to that other use case I was talking about a moment ago about modules and profiles. You should actually do a code-based approach here. And what I mean by that is using update hooks. The Lightning profile, Acquia Lightning, is a great example of this. There's a little bit of config that gets bundled up inside the install profile and installed, same with the modules. And then anytime those config files, anytime those config objects need to be updated, they just use update hooks in code to do it. This is really not well suited for lots and lots and lots of configuration, but it works great for modules and profiles. So if you're talking about managing config for a project, use config split. If you're talking about managing config in your module, your distribution, your whatever, you should probably look at the code-based approach, just because it's likely going to be a little easier for you and the users of your module to manage. And the big reason for that, again, remember, a project is a consumer of the configuration from your module. So if you make a config change at your module level, the project will need to likewise update their project level config to establish that. And if you update the config in your module, you're most likely going to need to do a database update hook to change the project level config anyway. So there's a really fascinating sort of upstream, downstream impact on configuration at the project level anytime you use this code-based approach. And a question from chat, would you ever use both, one way for your project and the code-based version of the distribution you've built for use in your project? I mean, you certainly could use both. You can do config overrides in the settings file. There's a global config object that lives in PHP that you can literally go into your settings.php file and do code-based changes. I usually advise against doing both, except in one very, very specific case. So let's imagine for a moment that you have fairly infrequent deployments into your production environment. Let's say because of the restrictions at your department or your agency, you can only do code deploys once a quarter for whatever reason. And let's imagine that you're fairly active in development between those deployments. So first sprint, the beginning of the new quarter, you go and build your blog, and you do all kinds of groovy things to your blog. And then you realize that there's something wrong with what you've done in the configuration that you've built, and you need to do a database update to fix it. Sometimes that happens, especially if there's some content somewhere that you need to change. In a good configuration workflow, and I talked about this a little bit ago, you're updating the database before you're importing the configuration. So every now and again, you can get into a situation where you've got a database update that assumes configuration exists, but because the database update is running before the configuration has imported, the config doesn't exist. And then you get into this weird chicken and egg problem because the database update won't work without the config, but you can't import the config until the database update is completed. So that is one of the few times where you can do something in code to manage your configuration sort of in parallel with your actual configuration management strategy. But I'm just going to jump ahead. Takeaway number 3 is do this or don't do it. Don't half-ass it. I would definitely avoid trying to do some in code and some in config split. If you're using config split, use config split. Going back a quick slide, I do have a bonus one that I want to talk about, and that's using the config ignore module. And again, this is recommended with an asterisk. This is not something you should liberally use. You can use it a little bit. So that system.site, the site name example I gave a little bit ago, that's an awesome use case for config ignore. I built a platform for a customer last year where they were going to have 80 sites running on a single set of configuration. And in that example, we did not do 80 different config splits because they all had the same basic features and functionality. There were just a few like Google Analytics, Google Analytics API key, site name, things like that were subtly different. So we just config ignored those couple of simple config items. So, when the site got installed, there was an install hook that defined a site name that was trash. Somebody would go into the site and hand change it to whatever. And then from there on out, the site name was just ignored. So no matter what changed in the actual config sync, the site name never changed. That's great for something simple, like a site name. That's terrifying for something much more complex, like entity config. So, just tread carefully with config ignore. Like I said, minimal use, simple config, you should be fine. This is not something, though, that you should be using as a blanket. I don't feel like managing my config, so I'm just going to ignore everything for an entity. That down that way lies pain. Especially because, again, ignoring the config means that you can't update it. It means you can't delete it. It means you can't change it in a normal config import. And back to Jess's question, this is one of those cases where you would have to do something in code to change config if it was config ignored. So again, use it. It is a best practice, but it is a best practice to use minimally when possible. We already talked about Yoda's takeaway. So let's take a moment and put some of these things together. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the Drupal GovCon codebase. This is open sourced, by the way, so you can get out to this out on GitHub. So what I'm showing you is there's nothing like proprietary here that I'm showing you that you wouldn't be able to see out on GitHub. The config directory here does contain 2 different folders. What we're using here is a config split based workflow. And that means that I have a default config. And if you look here, there's an awful lot of YAML files. You can go all the way down and find that system.site file. So this is an example of what simple config looks like. Quick question from chat, is this being recorded and available after the fact? Yes, to both of those. So you can see very simply, system.site name is Drupal GovCon. System.site mail is info@drupalforgov.us. The example I was just giving was that we basically config ignored system.site name. So I could put blah, 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 blah in here, and if I had config ignore set up properly, the site would continue to be Drupal GovCon. Like, it would never change the system.site name again. So this gives you an idea of what simple config looks like. Now let's go look at something a little more complex. Let's look at like the node type session config. This itself is still not that difficult, right? This is the actual node definition. But things start getting significantly more complex when we go in and look at like the session body experience level. If we went and looked at like the content entity view for the node session, now we've got all these config dependencies. Now we start getting into module dependencies, right? There's a lot more here in the entity config. So, you know, as a general rule of thumb, even though this is in code, even though this is YAML, even though it's designed to be human readable, it really is not expected to be hand massaged, right? If I really wanted to, I could probably just go in and make that change and it would probably be okay. But certainly not the case if I wanted to try and go into like our session submission view, right? Like my session schedules, like you should not be trying to alter a view for a site in the config YAML. Like that's a real surefire way to break your site. Use the UI for that. So use your config to sync your config. Use the UI to build your config, I guess is the critical takeaway there. The other thing I want to just show you very quickly is how config split can be layered in. So we've got our default config, and then we've got environment config. So in this case for GovCon, we're not really using this a ton, but that's okay. You know, for my local, you can see that I do have some different config. So my watchdog stuff is here for dblog. So those config objects are not part of the default config. They're only present for my local config. So when GovCon imports the config, it synchronizes everything with what's in config default, and then it imports locally this db settings and views.view watchdog.yaml to enable the dblog module locally. And obviously on a more complex project, you might see different things for CI, dev, prod, stage, etc. You could have completely different splits for all of those environments, and all that config lives right here on the site. And more, if you go look in your config default folder, this is where you'll actually see the definitions for those splits. So the split definition is in and of itself config. So here's my local split. You can see where to find it. So in this case, config environments local, easy enough. You can see that it turns on the dblog and devel modules. It's got some blacklist and graylist stuff, so it doesn't import that config elsewhere. It's pretty slick. We may come back and look at some more config stuff later on, but just wanted to give you a quick high level of what this actually looks like in the project. If we actually went down into a module now, you can see what some of this in-code config stuff looks like once my system decides to load. So like if we went and looked at the Lightning Media module, for example, they do have some config bundled up here, right? But significantly less config than what we saw up at the project level, because the only thing Lightning Media cares about is that config needed for Lightning Media. It doesn't care about what the Honeypot module needs for config. On the other hand, my project isn't going to work if I want to use Honeypot without the Honeypot config, and not going to work for Lightning Media without. So quick illustration of that. And then if you go into their install file, you know, here's a great example of them updating config. So Lightning Media Update 8016, if you're playing along at home, uses the config 4-module Lightning Media process to get the settings for Lightning Media and then it sets this entity embed choose display true object, it sets entity embed choose display to true, and then saves the config back. So in this case, Lightning Media is updating my config when this update runs, so that my site level config gets this. And then I would expect when I do a drush config export for my config default to get updated to reflect this change. A little confusing, a lot of moving pieces, but it is actually pretty straightforward once you have your head wrapped around it. So let's talk about how you design approaches and start pulling all these things together. First question, are you building something for single site or is it a multi-site? If it's a single site, let's move on with our lives. It's a lot easier. If it's a multi-site, are all of the sites going to have similar functionality? And this is something that people overlook time and time and time again. How many different environments is your code going to be running in? Do you have local dev, CI, stage, prod, or do you have multiple production environments in different servers or regions or whatever pulling in the same code base? If you are going to have similar features or different features across your platform, are they going to function the same way across the platform? Or are you going to have some sites where your carousels go left to right and some sites where your carousels go up and down? You got to think about that stuff. And how are you planning on deploying updates? So basically, what is your configuration management workflow? These are things, and many, many, many more things like this, but these are some of the questions I always ask myself right up front when I start thinking about how am I going to manage the config on a given site. For a single site, my recommendation is use config split and then have environment-specific splits. So again, dev, stage, prod, whatever. Minimally use config ignore, but in an ideal world for a single site, you should probably not need to config ignore anything, to be perfectly honest. Single site, you should be able to do everything you need to do in config with config split and then environment-specific splits. For a multi-site with standard features, meaning that even though you're going to have dozens and dozens and dozens of sites, you're basically using the same set of features. You know, everybody gets a blog, everybody gets a hero banner, whatever. Same exact recommendation, actually. Use config split with environment splits, and then minimally use config ignore. So use config ignore for your Google Analytics API key. Not for all of Google Analytics, just for the thing that is different between sites. Use config ignore for your system.site name, your front page, etc. Things like that, so that you can have a single set of config that is broadly applicable across your platform. Multi-site with different features is a significantly more challenging prospect. You can use config split and then have either install profile specific splits or site specific splits as well as environment splits. But this starts to get really challenging because in this particular example, you're talking about fundamentally building a bunch of different Drupal templates, a bunch of different Drupal sites, distributions, however you want to frame it. You're talking about fundamentally having sites that look and behave differently crammed into the same code base. And that is a really challenging prospect any way you shake it. And again, minimally use config ignore. The answer here is to not, paint broad swaths through your config with config ignore. The solution here is to get config split set up in a way that makes sense so that you can actually work with your multi-site. So how do you avoid causing a traffic jam as you start implementing this? The answer is automation. Putting humans in the loop here, trying to do this stuff manually is just going to lead to inconsistencies, and it's going to cause potentially even bigger problems. Using automation on your project can help you do a bunch of stuff, including automatically executing database updates and config imports at the correct time. Acquia does have an open source tool, BLT. If you've heard me talk before, you've probably heard me talk about BLT in the past. The biggest thing that BLT does for you in this case is that when you're doing development and as you're actually pushing your code up to the repository for review through continuous integration and ultimately out through deploy, BLT helps automate this configuration process for you. So if I'm doing development locally using BLT, my continuous integration is using BLT, and my deployment process is using BLT, theoretically, we're doing the exact same steps in the exact same order, and they'll all pass or fail in the exact same way. My favorite example of this is if I'm collaborating with somebody, back to what we talked about a moment ago about database updates. If I'm collaborating with somebody and she gives me a pull request and I test it, and she has been working locally by doing drush updb, drush config import. And when I get the code, I do it backwards, and I do drush config import, drush updb. I may very well see failures or successes that she does not, because we're doing our operations in a different order. If your DevOps person deploys into the cloud and is manually running all of the tasks required, and he or she forgets to run updb and then just does a config import, you could have gotten all the way through your development cycle. You could have done your QA and everything was fine. But now you just broke your production website because you tried to import configuration without running a database update. So automating this process to ensure that everybody's doing everything the same way, everywhere, every time, is really important. So last takeaway, everything everywhere should be the same. That means your configuration in the file system and in the disk, the database on disk should be the same. Your processes locally should be exactly the same as they are during your development process, your deployment process. If you do that, I'm not saying you're not going to get bit by config, but I am saying that if you are going to get bit, hopefully you'll see it so early in the process that you can recover, fix it, and then stick the landing where you need to. And with that, let's pause and see if there are any questions in our last 10 minutes or so. Go ahead and use the chat, please, if you have any. So I saw a question from a little earlier. Do you have a recommendation for a true beginner where to start if you haven't done anything with a website for a few years? How to sort of get back into Drupal at this point? I mean, I think, if you are a true beginner and if you are wanting to get back into Drupal, I would not dive right into configuration management. This is definitely a more advanced topic. Somebody on your team needs to be familiar with the stuff that I talked about here. Somebody needs to be sort of overseeing and governing this process. I don't know that you necessarily need to dive in directly. I would definitely suggest starting with basic Drupal site building. I would suggest getting a lay of the land for what's in Drupal 8, how it works, why it works, how to do certain things. And as your knowledge then begins to sort of deepen on Drupal itself, then you can start layering in things like, well, if I build this blog locally, or if I build this blog over here, how do I push it over there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would definitely not dive headfirst into configuration management. I would start a little higher up with just some of the basics and figure out how to do things in Drupal. So how do you handle database mismatches? All too many times we encounter this with little recourse aside from CM bypassing. So database mismatches are an interesting problem that you absolutely can run into. For me personally, the way I work to avoid those is I make sure when I'm doing development early on, not only am I doing clean installs of Drupal to make sure that my config and the development I'm doing works, but that I'm actually synchronizing down my databases from elsewhere and testing my processes there too. So, for me, I want to make sure that what I'm doing cleanly installs on a new site, but I also want to make sure that I can update old sites as well. And, again, that's a really critical process of working through that dev stage prod workflow. If you hit a database mismatch, you should see it in your local or in your develop environment. And at that point, you may have to write an update hook to sort of strong arm something, if you have to move data from one field to another, if you have to reformat something. I would definitely say that the longer you have, or the as time goes on, if you have a solid configuration and testing workflow in place, I think you will find that there is less and less likelihood that you'll have a database mismatch. Most sites, most builds that I do, I don't run into them anymore, just because I do so consistently use config split and the exact same process with BLT. Usually database mismatches happen because, again, somebody's doing something by hand someplace and not doing it by hand exactly the same way someplace else. So automation usually helps work around that. If I haven't answered your question, Alec, feel free to hit me up after the chat, after the presentation. We can talk more. Bob, I see you asked how config bites you. If you can maybe extrapolate on that a little bit, I'll come back to it. Is Multisite different than an installation profile that will be used for multiple sites? Yes, that's a great question. So Lightning is an example of an install profile that hundreds or thousands of projects have downloaded and included in their project. So in that case, you're just talking about an install profile that is used in multiple places. Multisite is actually using a single code base to power dozens, hundreds, thousands of Drupal sites. So instead of having 20 different code bases and 20 different hosting containers, you have a single hosting container that hosts 20 different sites. So yes, they are very different in that. They are definitely different concepts. So yes, Bob, I would definitely echo what you said there. Config can absolutely bite you if you're not doing testing between environments, if you're doing mismatched procedures, if you're doing things by hand one place and then you've got somebody running out to your production environment and changing things but not committing those config changes into your repository. If you have people trying to hand edit YAML files, if you have no configuration management strategy at all. Yeah, those are all great examples of how config can and will bite you every time. Even though, and as I said earlier, even if you do everything absolutely perfectly, the one that you will still probably get bit by eventually is if you have multiple people trying to work on the same feature at the same time in different branches. Sometimes you then get into some funky Git merging. So that just comes down to making sure that your lead dev, architect, program manager, whoever's assigning work or overseeing work, that you don't have two people trying to update the same thing at the same time. I mean, trying to diff separate branches of a view.yaml file is like, poking your eyes out. It's pretty challenging. So again, that's not really the configuration management or config workflow's fault. That's just you've got a team that's not communicating at that point. All right, I think I'm caught up with the questions in chat right now. Does anybody else have any other questions, given that we've got about 5 minutes left? All right, well, I'm going to assume that you do not. Definitely, if you don't have a local environment set up, I would definitely advise either looking at Acquia Dev Desktop, Drupal VM, Lando, Doxel, any of the sort of common environments that are floating around the interwebs right now. Set up a local and just go to town. If you haven't played with any of these config management strategies before, go do something simple, right? Go change your site name. Go, let users log into your site. Go build a content type. Start just kind of experimenting, as I said earlier, with some of the basics of Drupal site building. Commit all that you're doing into a local Git repository. You don't even have to throw it up on GitHub. Just start tinkering around locally in a way that you can diff what you're doing, and then export and import that config so you can see what impact it's going to have, and then you can build from there. So thanks everybody for coming. Jess, do you have anything else you want to cover?
No, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. I did want to just let folks know I've put the registration for next month's webinar in the chat message. So I encourage you to check that one out and register if you think you can attend. Even if you can't, go ahead and register, because what we try to do is after these webinars, for everybody that registered, you'll get an email post webinar with a short little survey. We ask you kind of just to tell us what you thought, but also includes a direct link to the recording of this particular one. So encourage you to sign up. And again, thank you, Mike, so much. I appreciate you doing this. And for those of you that are on the call, look out for the recording so you can use that for reference later on. And we'll see you guys around. Thank you.